It's never not going to be scuffed. It's always going to be scuffed, guys. I think what's really interesting is that I did not really watch any T1 this season whatsoever until I started doing these VOD reviews for MSI. So to an extent, I was totally immune to most of the conversations that were going on while T1 was like super hyped up. I didn't even watch the fucking final, guys. I watched like one game of the final, I think. We're going to talk about my extensive VOD reviews of both teams. Obviously my RNG VOD review is probably a little bit less extensive just because I spent the entire season watching them. And then we will kind of come to conclusions on who we think will effectively win if these two teams play against each other. There's always the chance that one of these teams gets BTFO'd in like bracket stage semis or in group stage, but you know, we want the hype match finals to be T1 versus RNG. They're the only two-time champions of MSI in the entire world, so that would be super cool and really exciting if that happened. Plus, like Faker versus Xiaohu, with majority rookie rosters, right? So that's really insane narrative right there. Very easy to sell, very exciting, fun for the whole family. Is that T1 are not kind of the way that you think of the traditional T1 team, which was the way that people had branded SK, basically all of Korean League of Legends, I think falsely, for many years, which is like their early game is really boring, and they scale, and they team fight, and they play macro better than everyone else. I think that that's almost completely the opposite of this T1. So gold differential at 15 minutes, 88%. I'm not a huge stats person. I just show this because it's the easiest way to illustrate kind of the difference between expectations of T1 if you didn't watch them at all this year and like previous T1s. So yeah, this is more coming out. The first thing is, though, to talk about this early game is T1 play a correct early game. If you watched the stream a couple days ago when I went over EG and G2, the difference between, I talked a lot about the wave timings for basically top ganks, mid ganks, being really focused on cannons. So this wave here, or at the top wave that's at the top T1 at the moment, is a cannon wave. So this is typically like the wave around which most teams will make really significant plays, and that's what makes the most sense. It's also way easier for jungler to prep for matchups like this. And Ryze is a champion that's very good at these things because Ryze will just spam C-Pot on wave to manage to get the wave in. On this is Kennen is already in lane in mid here to get this wave in and then look for a top. So this is like a very traditional setup. I'm gonna mute this. Setup for a top gank here on the wave that's coming in. So this is a little bit quieter than everything. But this is what I mean by like a correct early game. There's another example of this being like a correct early game. There's one thing that I think that Faker has traditionally done extremely well his entire career, which is basically just really understanding recall timers in relation to jungle, in relation to other lane timers as well. And there's obviously a good example of this in this one. Generally speaking, when we're talking about cannon waves, I think T1 understand cannon waves and do timings around cannons like pretty much clockwork based. Once again, if you are new to the stream, I do not believe in ad blocks, so this will happen sometimes. Oh no. Okay, we're good. So typically you would think about the 530 wave. 530, the wave that is mid at 530 is what I call the 530 wave, as opposed to the wave that comes out of base at 530. So this wave here that's coming out of base now is what I would call the 530 wave. So the typically you would see like Ryze recalling earlier to get an item so that he can make a play off of this wave coming out. But since he does not, right, he's still making a recall before hitting level 6. And then what will happen on this timer when he comes back to lane is he'll push this wave, right? They'll crash mid on this window. And then he'll basically lead top, which I think was really interesting. Basically, they leaned top so that this wave here is prepped. This Zeus should be able to trim and freeze. Zeus should be able to trim and freeze this. And that will allow Diana on the next timer. When the next mid, the 7-minute cannon wave, so like the wave that's mid at 7 minutes, goes on, they can make a play on bot, and bot will also be set up for this execution. So this is like very, very typical like clockwork timings on these types of plays. So when we talked about this in the G2 VOD review, or the G2 discussion the other day, we were very focused on how Jankos kind of tries to take earlier timers or tries to do things a little bit different so that his plays are not as easy to read, so to speak. Based on this understanding, so the reason why this wave is important is because this cannon will hit and then it'll give more timer for Faker to go mid. If you know that, you know that already. I know I'm saying a lot of really basic shit. It's not my intention to make people feel dumb. It's just kind of... or to bore people. It's just my intention to kind of explain this stuff to people who haven't heard of it before. So then this allows him to walk back very slowly because it takes longer for the turret to hold the cannon. So all of these timings are very, very basic understanding of just like game mechanics that are consistent game to game. Stuff that I think Faker has been very good at, like before anyone else was super good at it, right? So I think that's one thing to point out in terms of how T1 play out their early games is very correct. If you contrast it with the way the G2 play it, is Jankos is constantly finding timers that are like a bit early, so they're a little bit cheesy or unexpected in the sense that people know to expect ganks, know to prep waves for these specific timers to avoid getting dove or to avoid doing things, or jungles can make pass around these timers, or they know other laners can come to cover dives and things of that nature. So it's interesting to me to see T1 like play, the difference being T1 and G2 being that their early games are more correct. If we're talking about like the top 4 teams or the major region teams at MSI being like T1, G2, RNG, and EG, T1 play like the most quote unquote correct early game. And then G2 I think played the most like kind of cheesy, try to get as many like flipped gank timers as possible kind of early game style, and so they're the two best early game teams of the two. Well, when we're talking about like G2 for example, right, this is a situation where a BO1 like G2 could get an advantage over T1 theoretically, or maybe win a single game, right? If you're thinking about G2 versus T1, obviously these are the pool 1 seeds, so they won't play each other in BO1s. That this type of style of G2 playing is going to be more effective in BO1s when it's unexpected or strange. The reason why T1's early game is correct, or the reason why more people are likely to play it, is because, yes, you can counter it if you know the timers well, but if you don't counter it, it is extremely punishing. If you die on a stacked wave as a bot laner, especially versus like a Jinx, you're going to lose a shit ton of plates. You're going to get denied several waves of XP because you're usually stacking up waves, and then cannons are 1/3 of the XP and value of a normal wave. So just in general, it's very, very bad if you lose on a play on these types of timers, which is why these timers are so good, so reliable, and so easy to execute on, or so frequently executed upon. The one thing that I like to note is I feel like where T1 screw up is when it's Owner and Zeus. I feel like Owner and Zeus being inexperienced or not, T1 not typically playing around them, because usually T1 play to get like a shit ton of plates on Gumayusi and have him rotate around the map, is where we see the most mistakes. So for example, in the top gank that I pointed out before, they allocated like 3 members to that top gank, and then the top gank didn't go off because it was versus Akali. Typically, this is another difference between T1 and G2 early game. G2 will allocate like 4 members to this type of play to guarantee that they get it off if it's a play that's unlikely to happen because of Akali, Shroud, etc. Whereas like T1 just kind of used the pressure to try to make something work, and then it didn't stall out because Peanut read the gank and then was there to cover, right? The other... But I will say instead, like, they can capitalize on hope ganks by looking for counter jungle options and then leaning really, really hard into bot side, which is way more common for them. But if we look at other top ganks that I've seen that haven't gone well, either they've gotten outplayed or something along those lines, it's been way more common for plays around top if they're featuring only owner and our friend Zeus to go incorrectly. So it's very hard to like 2-mana Gragas typically as well. Obviously you have the ulti from Tryndamere, but this type of like judgment or this type of play in general should be difficult. This initial engage, like baiting out the basically ulting here before the Gragas body slam felt a little bit troll as well. And then he still has ulti. All of this was like I think Dove obviously played this well, but this type of like weird kind of misjudgments are more likely to happen if it's like Honor and Zeus. There's another one, but I'm not gonna like shame them, I guess. The other thing that I think is really interesting is... So I have a lot of examples of early game plays that are very well executed around Keria, which I think the next point that I wanted to go over was how Keria is basically the MVP. So there are just a couple of things like when we're talking about rift rotations, when we're talking about... You know what, I'll just show this one, because this one I thought was probably the most impressive thing that I saw, one of the most interesting or most impressive things that I saw in my T1 fighter review, and really illustrates kind of the difference between this T1 versus... Oh, crap, I just clicked on the wrong thing. Alright. The difference between this T1 and previous iterations of T1. So they go for this cover here, and then Faker ends up dying in this instance. So typically, so you also know Honor is shadowing bot. So this is like what Peter Dunn would call a hedging play. If you're familiar with like that whole debacle that happened on my stream and when he did his lectures, this would be known as a hedging play because you have basically Lee Sin shadowing on Jace, ready to make a play if something gets stalled out top because there's a ton of wave clear here. Zoe's entire responsibility is just to get the wave, and as soon as jungle shows, then you're in position to either make this play bots or to try to make this play bots and stall out the Tryndamere, which probably won't go that well for you because Dudu is like super far ahead, so the main goal is also to get this wave and then try to make this play top happen. So instead of calling off this play top, what they do is they know that the jungler is not going bot now. Honor sells out and gets this, gets these raptors. And basically, T1 Keria doubles down, right? They know a couple of really smart things here. One, they have a pretty good idea that Jarvan is going to be going top. And two, they know that they have Tom Kench, which has gray health, eats, like all of these things available, so they can stall out a ton of time. And they have the alcove for Jinx to buy. So Honor is able to walk all the way up, get raptors, and walk all the way up here. And Faker is able to TP. Theoretically, if HLE had played this better, right, they could try to hard commit, but there's still a lot of options that T1 didn't have to use to outplay this. So I really like this kind of read, or this like basic kind of map play here, and I feel like a lot of this stuff is possible because of Keria. But in general, Keria just plays extremely well. I would say that one thing that was really interesting because of how frequently, like clockwork, that T1 liked to play, like, okay, we're gonna get bot turret, then we're gonna swap, we're gonna go top, we're gonna ton of plates on Jinx. I specifically looked for VODs where they don't have Jinx, because obviously Jinx sucks on the MSI badge. And I looked and I found this. Hello, thank you for the follows, Linen Holon. Which... we are skipping ads. Tons of free ad space on my stream, guys. Tons of free ad space. We're... so this play, actually, I should go back to show fully how this play is set up. Thank you for the resub. Stream announcement, invest Discord. Maybe. So typically, okay, so first they make this play execution on bot to get the wave and to create a window to go top. So that's number one. They get Dove's ultimate and they work off here. Thank you for the follow. Thank you for the follow, Matt. And they lean top off of this. So what the first thing they do is they make sure that they get the wave and bot by making this play here. And then they lean all the way top to do this. They know that they're not going to be able to create an optimal siege scenario with Vayne where you're taking a ton of plays. That's not how the champ works. It's not feasible. So they changed their win con to play around the Jace. And this is a situation where I think is like very, very advantageous for them. Because if you're involving Keria in these top plays, they're more likely to go better. So that's kind of the assumption that I'm working off of, is that they will play more around top lane at MSI based on kind of how they're operating with the meta AD carries available. If Jinx is not a big thing for them, then they'll change and they'll involve Keria more in these dive or these top plays, and so they're less likely to get fucked up. So that's one thing that I'm operating off of, or one thing that I'm thinking about. So the last thing that we want to talk about is XX macro. They play both side lanes though. I mean, yeah, they made this skirmish around bot so that they could get a window for Keria to go top. Keria doesn't go top that often, is what I noticed. Like when they play Jinx, Keria will go top only if they're doing lane swaps usually. Which is very different from pretty much any of the other supports from the major regions. So let's talk about XX macro. One thing that I noticed is once you get towards mid-game, T1 do not actually play that well off of side wave timers. So when the map state is more open, you're more likely to have situations where T1 just like run at you in a specific situation. And Gen G are the ones who have like better wave timers off of sides. So Kali can get this almost entirely for free. This Baron fight doesn't go super well, and then T1 basically just respond by rushing mid all the way when Gen G are actually the ones getting side waves here. And setting up so that there's no counterplay. So if this all-in mid play doesn't go well, which it ends up doing, they basically stall out the map entirely. And even though it does go well, they aren't really able to get a lot off of it, and there's potential for this to be a more advantageous top trade for Gen G than for T1, right? So this is, and then also because they got this wave in all the way, and the next Drake is up in like 50 seconds, it's very easy for Gen G to now pivot their setup to the side. The fact that T1 stalled their recalls out to get that T2 turret. He said this is basically going to be a guaranteed dragon. So a lot of people remember this game because this was the game that Gen G won in the finals as the game that T1 threw by just like trolling at the Baron. But there's so many mistakes that lead up to this point if you watch like throughout this game for the next like 5 to 10 minutes that led to the Baron falling. And a lot of people said, oh no, they just were like hyphy because they were super ahead or whatever. But there are a lot of like kind of weird mid-game mistakes that T1 make. I think as a result, what I like them playing the most is like long-range poke comps, which is why I think Jace is so good for them as a champion, is because they're very good at standing on mid, poking people with Jace, and poking people with Zoe. Like there was a Zoe Jace game that I thought was quite good. And for me, it was like, okay, well, T1's bigger advantages come from when they're able to play, like, look at you on the mid-wave and play from there. They're actually very good at allocating more numbers on the mid-wave to get ahead than at an earlier timing than a lot of teams, which will let them get rift or they'll let them get turrets. The other thing T1 don't like is dragons. They're almost always in a position where they're betting that they can snowball enough early where the dragon stacking of the enemy team doesn't seem to matter. So that's something that actually doesn't give them an advantage though, because RNG are like that too. What is the background soundtrack? I'm listening to a Spotify playlist. Which is why you're hearing all sorts of random ads. Like Burlington. I haven't heard Monty's thing, but I mean that's just a thing. Like you poke and then Nautilus hard engage and you kill someone. That's like a poke / pick comp. It's not too uncommon. Yeah, I know Bean's playlist. You thought it was Dagda. So that's generally speaking like the strengths and weaknesses that I have for T1 that are relevant in the RNG matchup for the most part. The next element of it. So now we talk about RNG. If you've watched my stream, I've been flaming LPL a lot. I think what's really relevant when we talk about RNG is the context of LPL going into the season. Almost every single team made bad roster decisions except RNG. So my anticipation was that teams like BLG would do well in spring, but that RNG would end up being the best team by summer. And the biggest reason why I thought RNG would take a ramp up period was because of Bin. Bin. Let's talk about Bin, guys. Let's talk about Bin, because I called out Zeus and Honor as not necessarily executing top lane plays very well. But we should talk about Bin. Because if anyone doesn't know, this is Thunder Talk. They're bad. But RNG somehow found a way to almost lose this game because of the way that Bin likes to play. Bin, by the way, the reason why we pick Jax is because Bin plays every champion like it's Jax. If you guys are not familiar with generally the mechanism for Jax, it's usually you are looking to pop your E and all in repeatedly in order to basically win the matchup. Otherwise, you just kind of get like harassed for free. You're incentivized at this champion to just like repeatedly all in over and over. When you're repeatedly all in, you're pulling creep aggro and you're throwing the wave. You're throwing the wave to crash earlier. You have way less control of the timing of the wave, which makes Bin very susceptible to ganks. Makes Bin very likely to flip his entire lane state. Like in this case, he just kind of goes all the way past the wave, has no E anymore, is able to take a ton of would be in position to take a ton of aggro, and then loses his full comp. Can't get his full combo off. I didn't see the full trade, but I mean, this guy, he's trolling. He does this shit all the time. I have a ton of examples of this. This is just one of the earlier ones that I remembered that I pulled off, and I used a bad team to illustrate that he does this regardless. Oh, I have another one here. But it's very, he's very kind of, like, when we talk about flips, I have an auto flip list. I count flips on my stream when I'm doing LPL co-streams. And bin is on the auto flip list, meaning bin being in the game counts as a flip in and of itself. This is a good one. If you notice here, Biobio is almost Meganar. Yep. Goodbye, friend. So that's bin, if we want to talk about bin. So that's bin. The reason why bin is relevant is because we talked about some of the weaknesses of T1, or some of the peculiarity of T1's early games, where they are timing plays specifically around cannons, and which ends up being predictable. And also the fact that they're able to play, that they sometimes struggle when they play around top with just their jungle and just their mid and just their top laner in some of these plays. I think because of the way that bin plays, none of that is relevant, because they'll be able to get off whatever plays they want, since bin will mismanage the wave. And he plays like there is no jungler anyway, so it doesn't matter if the plays are predictable, he will still die to them. He will he will also just kind of play like a psychopath and put himself in situations where he can get executed on just by really, really simple plays, and won't be playing for that. A lot of players these days grew up playing LoL since they were little kids, because a lot of them are super young. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true of T1 players as well. Is JoJo a mid lane bin? It's a lot easier to be a mid lane bin than a top lane bin, because being a top lane bin, super long lane. Also, I don't think JoJo permanently goes for all-ins. JoJo plays the lane like a bit more, plays trades a bit more nuanced than that. This is a big dick version of blame game. Tempo correction. So, the interesting thing about this matchup is that Ming is also kind of the MVP. Actually, I should check my agenda to make sure I'm going in order. Yeah, so the other thing is Wei's been bad. Like, Wei was very good last year, and the main reason why I think that Wei has gotten better. So here's an example. So RNG reverse swept JDG to stay in upper bracket. I'm just going to play a random Wei clip as we talk about this topic. So, effectively, RNG reverse swept JDG to go through this. I mean, Wei's been making like a lot of really predictable plays, or a lot of really obvious plays, and not being able to get anything in the early game when he plays stuff like Volibear. Before, RNG would set up plays, like, they were the kings of, like, 4-man tops at, like, 330, where they would time the top wave on range versus melee matchups to 4-wave crash, and then jungle, support, mid would all be there on that window. Since they don't really have a clear win con around top like that anymore, I feel like Wei's pathing has either become super predictable in terms of the plays that he goes for, or he just doesn't do anything. Thank you for the follows, Emsura, Dan the Puppy, and Intem Madman. The RNG. Shouldn't RNG bring Karsa back? So, if we want to talk about Karsa and Peanut, that's a whole other stream. But my TLDR is probably not. I think Wei probably just needs to, like, grow up. I'm gonna be really honest. Like, this is... It's just very kind of rookie issues. I think Honor has, like, a lot of rookie issues as well. Like, probably jungle is the weakest part of both teams, if I'm really honest right now. Of both T1 and RNG. But he had a lot of problems. He also has been mis-executing mechanically, though, so that's like another problem that Way's had. But I don't know. JJ played like absolute garbage domestically and then shit on everyone at Worlds, so who knows. My head when Gala isn't even the weakest on the team. We'll get to Gala. But as a result, you have a lot of examples where I would say that Ming is the MVP of the team. Similar to Keria, I think that these are probably the two best supports in the world. Keria and Ming. So here you have Ming, like, picking up a lot of slack from Wei, basically just to keep track of enemy jungler. Like, you'll see that frequently in a lot of the games, is he'll be the one looking and going into jungle, looking vision, which is a typical support role. But he's been able to kind of stop the bleeding in a lot of situations where I think that this happens. And so that's relevant because I think Honors pass like very predictably in the sense that these are the timers, this is where I am, this is what I need to be, this is what I'm doing. So it should be very easy for Ming to track him. So even if Wei has like zero pressure, they can have an idea of where the jungler is. Again, because of how Ben plays, I don't think it matters that much. For top lane, like, top lane should be an easy snowball win comp for T1 versus RNG anyway. But it's worth noting that a lot of, like, strengths from the team come from Ming. Ming also is very good at timers that save support. So this is where I would say that, like, you can draw parallels between G2 and T1's early games and talk about the differences. I think you can actually draw comparisons between EG and RNG's early games. Because you have support covering mid a lot in RNG as well. When it should be a jungle responsibility. So like Hecarim on camp, knowing that Beishang can be or should be mid on this wave right before, like on the 7-minute wave, where you have a window or a timer to make a play or move as Ahri or as Vex. And then Ming is here, right? And Wei is finishing a camp. Now, let's talk about Gala a bit before we get into the side laning aspect of RNG, because I think Gala is very interesting. I remember this play because it was good. So before I flame him, we're gonna show this. Yeah. But Gala is interesting because I like to say that Gala is plays every champion. So if I say Bin plays every champ like it's Jax, Gala plays every champion like it's Kai'Sa. He basically uses Gale Force on cooldown. Effectively is constantly in situations where, so that was a fun outplay. But he uses Gale Force on cooldown kind of like it's a Kai'Sa R. And goes for all-ins to 1v1 kind of assassin people. So he plays 80 carries like assassins. Here's another Gale Force clip if we want to see it. He just basically starts a lot of fights with Gale Force. Even when it's not necessarily the most optimal play. Like, if he could hold it and look for, like, the perfect situation, like, why are we Gale Forcing into the back of the pit, right? Like, these types of situations. Obviously, in this case, this ended up going favorably for them, but it's the concept in general when he opened situations with Gale Force. He's So that means champions like Tristana are super good for him. Tristana getting buffed is very nice for Gala. I think the so we have even already in the RNG TES series, Gala already pulled out Tristana versus Jinx. So very prone to playing these types of all-in champs, very prone to doing this. If you look at the champions that should be really relevant at MSI, like Ezreal, Lucian, a lot of these champs have reposition tools, so the meta should be way more favorable for Gala. I think in general, one of the things that RNG struggled with a lot this spring is that a lot of champions, you had to self-reposition or you had to space extremely well, and play like a lot of front-to-back team fights. RNG will play way better in situations where they can play picks off of sideline pressure, and Gala's champion pool is one of the main reasons for that. So I think that's a good thing for RNG compared to their domestic performances. Alright, so when we talk about RNG's mid-game, I do think that this is where they can have an advantage over T1. Because whereas I would say that if we talk about TES, I think, so I've seen a lot of analysts actually compare T1 and RNG as being similar, but I actually think that TES's mid-game is way more similar to T1's, not because it's terrible and like inexcusably awful, but because of the fact that they will often go for these long range comps, because they will often stand on mid wave and poke people off of it to look for engages like that, rather than focusing on side lanes. I don't know if it's true that RNG is still the best side laning team in the world, but they are still extremely good at it, relative to a lot of the other teams at MSI. They're the best team at MSI for side laning, let's put it that way. So, this is like a very typical way that RNG will set up the map in the game. So we have our Xiaohu showing on this wave, and then Bin taking the blue buff. So this is something Bin here, but Bin is still like not necessarily trying to show in the jungle. So he's losing pressure so that RNG can pivot hard to this side. Gala isn't overextending on the mid wave like this either in this situation. And then as soon as they get this T1 tower, we'll start to see, and they get these bot side camps, we'll start to see RNG pivot to take top side pretty far ahead of JDG. And I don't think JDG are a bad side laning team in the context of LPL either. And even like Xiaohu does this little cheeky play where he shadows and tries to kill Hope again. But then immediately Ben is already pivoted here, getting this top wave, and you already see Ming and Wei walking into topside vision to take this side. So they're constantly able to keep pressure in the sidelines like this, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, which causes enemy teams to spread thin and force them into situations where they don't have to teamfight them, which for RNG last year was very advantageous because they weren't like the best front-to-back team-fighting team, and I would say they still aren't. So again, once again, if the meta is much more focused on all-in 80 carries or champs like Jhin, etc., it's a way better meta for RNG in general.
Every single student free 24/7 access to tutoring. Visit paper.co to find out if your child has access to paper today.
Bin for sure is a top laner. Then this is a situation where potentially like RNG can do well versus T1. Because if you remember, the fact that Genji were able to get setups on Drake and setups on Baron led to kind of the Baron play disaster that happened in that game that they lost. And most of the games that I've seen T1 lose have either been because of top lane focus misplays or because of side lane macro from the enemy team. So that's also consistent with like the sandbox and HLE games. So, what is my general overall conclusion then? So my general conclusion overall is I do actually still favor T1 just because I think RNG in the early game plays into a lot of conditions that T1 needs for a snowball. And also because I think that T1 will have a champion pool where they're more likely to send Keria topside, which will guarantee better top lane play, and better plays around top than they've typically had. And that said, though, I don't think it's like an open and shut case. Like, I think if they get to a situation where they are not losing every single Drake, it's actually really, really possible for RNG to win. And I think RNG are likely to lose BO1s, but they won't play T1 and BO1 phase. So I think that's but RNG actually have a pretty decent chance in BO5s. Like, I rate this as a much closer matchup than I think a lot of people do. But I do still favor T1, mostly because of the fact that I think their early game is pretty free for them, since RNG don't respond that well. And 2, because like it's support diff, and I do think Keria is a bit better than Ming, even though these are the best 2 supports in the world. So that's kind of where I am. I think there were a couple of games in playoffs, if you watch, where Ming was kind of invisible, and that was disappointing, like when I went back and watched them. So I think in terms of jungle support, it's like both teams have kind of a weak jungler and a strong support, but T1 has a slight edge in both positions.